We are about to be entertained by Blashers to tell us about guns in wild places. Over to you, John.
Well, my friends, it's very nice to see such an august gathering of the Pistol Club this time of day, and I really congratulate you. You all turn up at Crabby in these numbers, and I'm sure the club will continue to thrive. Derek asked me to talk about guns in wild places. Well, I actually start off talking about when I left Victoria and went to Sandhurst. I eventually went back again to Sandhurst as an instructor, and because of my interest in guns generally and pistols, I was put in charge of the pistol shooting training, and we had all sorts of exciting combat ranges where we used to shoot people. If you had a white armband, you got -2 in your score. If you had a black armband, you got +2. It was a sort of differentiate between friends and foe and so on. But I'll talk a bit more about that later on. But I always want to remember one of the things was the adjutant. The adjutant was a very splendid character in the Scots Guards, enormously tall and very military, walked rather stiffly, partly because he had a wooden leg. But most of the time he didn't walk anyway. He rode a horse, which was pure white, which with his groom running beside him, holding the bridle. And he happened to say to me one day, "Oh, I enjoy a spot of pistol shooting." I said, "Really? Do you have a pistol?" "Yes," he said, "I have a Luger." So anyway, we were on the range, and all the cadets were lying down at 100 yards. We were teaching him to shoot with two hands out, lying down, to show that you could actually, with a pistol, fire at quite long range. We were shooting at these metal plates that we normally fire with rifles. And suddenly the white horse appeared with the adjutant, and there was a highly polished leather holster on his hip, and it was a German Luger. And he decided to get off the horse, which was probably wise, and walked up to the firing point. He didn't lie down, because he had these wonderful doe-skin breeches, which got rather muddy lying. But he stood there looking very grand, with his pistol. And at 100 yards, he was actually hitting these plates with a pistol, handheld, which is a remarkable shot. And after a time, the cadets came over to him and looked at this and said, "Where did you get this pistol, sir?" "Oh," he said, "it's a silly story, but during the war, I was with my platoon in a village in France, and we were engaging some of the Germans, and I came around the corner of the building, and there was a German, and I pulled out my pistol, which was a rather silly little .38, and we exchanged fire, and the wretched fellow shot me in the leg. But at that moment, I shot him, and we sat down, and both of us had run out of ammunition. But I didn't tell him, and I crawled over to him because I couldn't walk, and we had a talk. I spoke German, and I discovered he was a non-commissioned officer. He was quite a nice fellow, really, and so I took him prisoner, and I took his Luger. And this was a sort of story told about this gun. Well, later, of course, he trod on a mine, and he lost the rest of his leg, so he lost his leg completely when I knew him. But we decided to form an officers' pistol club, and there were a number of the officers who could shoot reasonably competently. And we entered a competition at Bisley, and we put in the team, and it was one of these, they called it the clay pigeon competition, I think, and you had little clay pigeons set up on posts, and you had to run 50 yards, pick up your pistol, and then open fire. And I think you had 1 minute from the time you had to start running to run the 50 yards, pick up the gun, and knock as many plates down as you could. They probably do it still today. We entered this. We did rather well, and the adjutant shooting with his Luger never missed. I mean, he was absolutely deadly, and we actually got through to the semi-final, quite the semi-final, but getting towards the semi-final. And at that point, he came over to me and he said, "John, I've got a slight problem. And I've got a problem with my leg." Well, I knew he got a wooden leg, and it was quite hard to run 50 yards for him anyway. But he'd been doing it. And he said, just like a slight adjournment while I adjust my leg. So I went up to a rather stuffy gunner colonel who was running the thing, and I said, "You didn't have a 5-minute adjournment because one of my team members has got to adjust his leg." "His what?" "His leg." "Yes, he's got to put on a new leg." "Don't be stupid." I said, "No, no, I'm saying he has a wooden leg." "Wooden leg? You can't have a wooden leg. How do you mean about it?" I said, "No, no, he has." By this time, the adjutant was sitting down, and he put his foot up, and his batman arrived, touching his new leg. Out came the leg, on with another one. And he actually was bleeding a certain amount. He actually injured himself running. But anyway, he continued running, and we got through to the actual or the final, I think it was. And we were shooting against a team of very, very experienced Remy warrant officers who worked crack shots. They were all armourers. And these chaps were magic. Well, we never thought we'd reach such heights. But the umpires decided to hold the match in the evening. Well, we had a dinner night that night, and of course that was mandatory, because we had to be there, certainly the adjutant. So he said, "This is going to be jolly tight, I don't know how we're going to do this." So he said, "Well, I think I'll work something." So we went back to Santos, and we got into our mess kit ready for the dinner night, with our bow ties and full dress uniform and everything, and rushed over to Bisley. And we got to the firing point as everyone was getting ready. And this stuffy little umpire came up and said, "You can't go on dressed like that, that's not uniform." And I always remember the adjutant drew himself up and said, "I think I'd like to consult my Colonel-in-Chief on that." And of course, Colonel-in-Chief is the Queen, and that was the end of the argument. But we didn't actually, I'm sorry to say, we didn't actually win. We got knocked out by the Remy team. But I can always remember this chap running up, and then probably go down in the history of Bisley of these officers who turned up in full mess kit to shoot in the final with the chap with the wooden leg. We had this combat pistol range that we talked about at Santos, which was built in the woods. And it was a tremendous success, and all the cadets who volunteered went through this training, which took something like 6 weeks. It was done in spare time, but you came up in the evening and you fired a huge amount of ammunition, and you started right with the sort of basics of how to shoot a pistol. And then you were eventually taught not only about the standard British Army pistol at the time, which was, those days was the .38 Webley, which was changing into the Browning, but it was in those days a very useless weapon. But you were also taught about other weapons of other armies. So we had a great collection of firearms. So people were taught to assemble them and shoot with them. And not only did we stop at pistols, I remember we brought all sorts of things up out of the armoury, including a Tommy gun, which was great fun, pumping away with this thing. A heavy weapon, I've never fired one, but it's not something that I would have liked carrying around in normal warfare. But anyway, this range was extremely popular, and I still meet cadets who say, "You taught me to shoot a pistol all those years ago." But one incident I always remember was the final part of this course was you had to follow a white line, and you went through some trees, and targets ran across your front and jumped all over you, all over the place. And right at the end, there was a target, a figure 11 as we call them, target, that came up in front of you and fired at you. And it had a clever little device with an igniter on it, so up came this target, its gun in its hand went pop, and a bullet appeared to hit the ground right in front of you, which actually was a small detonator buried in the earth, and it was all connected electrically, so it was quite realistic. So suddenly up came the target, bang went his gun, pow, and you got showered in earth, and you then had to fire back, and the target was only going to stay up for 1 or 2 seconds. It was very, very short, and so most people were usually, by the time they got their gun up, the target was down. But one chap called David Bromhead, who was the descendant of Bromhead VC of Rorke's Drift, was an absolutely marvellous shot. He could sort of point and shoot wherever he pointed, the bullet would go. And we used to practice them doing this with pointer torches and pointing at things just to see that they could actually point and hit the various targets. And this chap, as this enemy, I suppose, came up, hurled himself down, and he was using I think at the time it was a 45 Smith & Wesson, and he literally threw himself forward, fired in midair, hit the target, down it went, and he got the top marks. And he was the only chap that ever achieved a possible of 80 out of 80, I think. And because of this marvellous shot he made, and I can remember him well. Well, of course, years later, that was to prove very useful, as I'll tell you in the next story. But just one other fun little story about the combat pistol range, because it went on for several years, and it was a great success. One day, a chap turned up from the, I think it was the Broadmoor Mental Asylum, which was behind Sandhurst, and made a complaint that occasionally bullets were flying over the walls. Well, of course, the range had been cited by the Small Arms School Corps, bearing in mind the template used for 38 Webleys. But of course the 9mm Browning and the Luger and things were much more powerful, and these bullets were flying over the range and landing up amongst the patients, who were all reckoned to be a bit doddery anyway, coming over the top. So that was the end of the pistol range. Unfortunately, we weren't allowed to use it with the new pistol. But coming on to this other story about David Bromhead, in 1968 we had tackled the exploration of the river, the Blue Nile, in Ethiopia. And this was set up by request of Haile Selassie, who was then the emperor. The area was known to contain a lot of dissidents and bandits and people who didn't like paying income tax and so on, who would shoot at anyone they saw on the river. And so our expedition was armed, and we were really more concerned about the crocodiles and the hippos and things than we were about people. But we had seen people around, and they were usually fairly well armed, mostly with old British 303 rifles and a few Italian Beretta rifles that they'd kept from the war, but they weren't particularly heavily armed. So we didn't think that was going to be a great problem, but we issued everyone with a 45 Smith & Wesson or a 45 Webley, which, as you all know, I mean, the slow-moving old lead 45 is a very good man-stopper. And I'd actually got something different. I got a 38 Special, but another long story that I had fitted out, which was very light. You may remember the song, a 38 Special on an airweight frame. Well, this is really what this was. Long barrel, 6-inch barrel, 3.8, and fairly accurate gun. But anyway, we had carried on with this exploration down the river, and on the final stages, there were 10 of us in inflatable boats. We'd had a little trouble with the locals, who decided to take us prisoner for a while, and we were outnumbered by about 40 to 1, I think, by these chaps, who were very pleasant about it. They said they didn't really have any grudge against us personally. It was merely the fact that they didn't want to pay income tax, and they felt that if they took us prisoners, then the emperor would forgive them paying tax, and that was that. We explained that the emperor couldn't care a dot for us, and it would make no difference. But in the end, we did manage to escape from these people, and we slipped away early one morning when they were still asleep by leaping into our boats and paddling like Billy-O down the river. And we soon got well away from them. So we thought, well, that's that. We've shaken off these bandits, and that's probably what they were. And we arrived at an island about 25 miles further on, and it was towards the end of the day, and I decided that perhaps it was a good place to stop, because if we were going to be attacked by anyone else, we were on this little sort of sandy island in the middle of the river, which had some trees in the middle, and we made a camp and built what we used to call a zoriba, a sort of thorn fence around it, put our tents in the middle, and we were just getting ready to cook some supper when 2 young men appeared from Ethiopia.